Hi friends, it's Mawdiay Faith or Mrs. J again I have Fearful's Journey Through the Desert and a lovely cup of apple cider because it is a gorgeous fall day and I thought that we could read another chapter of Fearful's Journey Through the Desert. If you are just joining us, we are on chapter 2. I have 2 other videos for chapter 1, Fearful's Journey Through the Fearful's Journey Through the Desert, chapter 1, part 1, and Fearful's Journey Through the Desert, chapter 1, part 2. If you have not seen those, why don't you go check those out before you join us right now for chapter 2. I hope you are enjoying this book, those who have already read chapter 1 with me, and I hope you will enjoy it and continue reading with me in chapter 2. Let's get into it. Prince Iniquity didn't come. As the sky was being painted with shades of pinks, purples, and golds, they finally came to the desert. Prince Anointed One put a hand on her shoulder, and for the first time in her life, Fearful saw the magnificence of the sunset. It was glorious. "We'll make camp here," Prince Anointed One said, surveying the endless desert with one sweeping glance. "Will you please get some water?" Dumbfounded, Fearful took the bucket from Prince Anointed One. Never in her life had she ever heard the word please uttered by anyone except her grandparents and parents. Everyone else just ordered her around. What seemed even more astonishing was that it came from someone in an authoritative position. Why would a prince say something like that? She didn't understand. There was an oasis only about 20 yards away. With the rough wooden bucket handle rubbing against her hand, Fearful walked off. On the way there, she was deep in thought. Could Prince Anointed One be the better choice? From what she had found out so far, he was polite, even making her feel safe. All that surely couldn't be fake with that truthful look in his eyes. Or could it? Still, the wrath of Prince Iniquity stood before her. If he was in a tolerable mood, he would just throw her in the dungeon with the rats for the rest of her life. Rats? Would you want to be in a dark, dirty dungeon with rats? I wouldn't. Ugh. He'd have her tortured and then killed in the most agonizing way, hanging on a cross if he was not in a tolerable mood. Her dread of him made nothing seem safe. She entered the oasis shelter by a narrow, beaten-down path. She knelt down at the water's edge. Looking all around her, she was fascinated by the sense of safety in this place. It was like no one had ever been there to mar the beauty. The tall trees grew around the oasis with bushes and flowers growing in between them and around the water. The only way out was the narrow path by which she had come in. The smell of the flowers filled the air in this sanctuary. It reminded Fearful of something, but she couldn't put her finger on it. The only sound that disturbed the still quiet was the dim sound of her father and Prince Anointed One setting up camp. "If only you could see this place, Mother. It's so quiet and safe. It feels like here nothing could ever. I miss you so." Have you ever had someone you miss because they're gone? It's hard missing someone that's gone away. I have that. My grandpa's gone. My grandpa and grandma are gone. I miss them lots. Let's keep reading. Fearful looked down into the water, and tears rolled down her cheeks and fell into the water, blotting out her reflection. The emptiness Fearful felt was unbearable. She missed her mother so much. Just then, something odd happened, for she could hear her friends' voices in her mind. "Fearful, please come back. I need you," came Scaredy Cat's pleading whimper. "Please, Fearful, don't be stubborn. Prince Iniquity is furious," Boastful arrogantly taunted her. Fearful argued out loud with her friends' voices, saying, "I can't come back. Prince Iniquity will kill me like he did my mother. I can't come back. If you don't come back, he'll be even more furious. He'll find a punishment worse than death." Prideful mocked. "I won't come back," Fearful screamed as she ran out of the trees scared. She rushed back to the campsite, hardly caring if the water spilled. She was so frightened. Fearful held her breath when Prince Anointed One's form came in front of her. She braced herself for the scolding or whipping she knew she was in for being tardy. Instead, she got something totally new to her, and it shocked her. Prince Anointed One knelt so he could look into her lowered eyes. "Thank you. Now will you please start supper? You will find all that you need in those." He pointed to a pile of packages wrapped in burlap sacks. While Fearful went about cooking the meal, Prince Anointed One wandered off somewhere. An ambassador of trust chopped up some logs that had been lying there when the three travelers had come to the spot. "Father, where is Prince Anointed One going?" Fearful's curiosity was aroused at Prince Anointed One going off to the south as though going to meet someone, even though there wasn't a village or anything for miles. To talk to his father, there is a small cave cut into those mountains where Prince Anointed One likes to go to meet with the king when he's gone from the castle. Ambassador of Trust wiped the sweat off his brow with his sleeve and then pointed to a group of mountains dwarfed by distance. "It would take days to get there," Fearful exclaimed in shock. "To the king and prince, distance is nothing." Ambassador of Trust piled the wood he had chopped up by the fire ring. Fearful's brows knit together as she fell into deep thought. She didn't understand these royals. Prince Anointed One came back as Fearful was taking the lamb off the spit. Her father had set up over the fire. "That smells delicious," he remarked, taking the heavy platter from her just before she was about to drop it and setting it on a big boulder that she had been using as a table to set the food on. She stared at him in amazement. Would his kindness never cease? He grinned at her amazement. She then realized what she was doing and quickly lowered her eyes, quaking with shame and fear. She jumped when what she'd expected to be a hand going to box her ears was a hand that caressingly cupped her face and gently forced it up so she was looking at him. In his eyes was that deep love that had astounded her that morning. "My father has given you such pretty hazelnut eyes. Will you please give me the honor of looking into them from now on?" Whatever pleases you, sir," Fearful stammered. "Good. Now come sit with us and dine." Fearful gasped to hear such an invitation. A slave eat with a prince? She gave Prince Anointed One a confused look, unsure if she had heard him right. He just smiled and patted the log beside him. They both looked over to where Ambassador of Trust was struggling with one of the donkeys that had one of the food packages in its mouth. Ambassador of Trust was pulling for all he was worth, but the donkey wouldn't give it up. He was grunting and growling and making quite a comical sight. Prince Anointed One shook his head, chuckling. He said something Fearful didn't understand, and the donkey let go of the package right away. Ambassador of Trust went sprawling on the ground. "Thanks, Your Highness," Ambassador of Trust said, laughing at himself as he picked himself up and dusted off his tunic and trousers. "I'm not real hungry, so I think I'll go for a walk." Prince Anointed One just nodded. He bowed his head as Ambassador of Trust walked off. "Salutations, Father. I ask that you bless this food to the nourishment of our bodies. We thank you that this journey is going to end in success. Amen." Fearful just stared at him as he talked to a father who wasn't even in sight. She looked, but even her father had disappeared into the fading light. The only other living beings around were the donkeys, who were eating the hay in front of them. "Do you find it odd that I should thank my father for the food he gives us?" Prince Anointed One gave a questioning look. Fearful shook her head, feeling awkward. She got up and served up the food and then sat down beside Prince Anointed One. As hungry as Fearful was, she just picked at the food. The question of Prince Iniquity coming after her was nagging her more than ever. She kept looking over at Prince Anointed One, wishing she could ask, but afraid that he would become angry at her. "You have questions in your eyes," Prince Anointed One stated, looking her straight in the eye. Taking a little courage in Prince Anointed One addressing her, she asked the question, "When I'm here in the desert with you, but I'm out getting water or something, could Prince Iniquity steal me back?" "According to the laws my father set, you are to be serving my father. Yet he gives you free will to disobey. Now, since you were a child and had no choice but to go where your parents went, you were a slave of Prince Iniquity. However, now you have a choice. Until you make the choice to serve my father, though, you are still under the power of Prince Iniquity. I can make you one promise, however. I will never be so far away that you can't call for help, wherever you are." What do you think? Will she need to ask him to fulfill that promise? Will he fulfill that promise? Let's keep reading and find out. This promise made Fearful feel somewhat better and gave her the courage to ask her next question. "This morning you said that both my parents were requesting that you come for me, but my mother is dead." "Because you let her be murdered" was on the tip of her tongue, but she bit her tongue to keep that phrase back. Prince Anointed One looked at her with a gentle smile. "That, my child, I cannot answer." "Who can, then?" she shouted in reckless frustration. Instantly she regretted those words. Her eyes got big with terror, and she cowered, awaiting her punishment. Instead, she felt a tender arm wrap around her shoulders. "In time, daughter. In time, I can." She buried her face in his arm and wept. She was desperately lonely, missing her mother with her entire being. He let her be. When she moved to wipe her tears away, he let her go. She awkwardly looked down at her food, uncertain whether she should thank him or say nothing. He gently nudged her. She looked up to see a gentle grin sparkling in his brown eyes. He knew she was grateful. That was enough for now. She smiled in return and turned hungrily to her plate. They had walked a long way today, and she had worked up an appetite. "You like lamb?" Forgetting herself, Fearful looked up to find that Prince Anointed One was staring at her. This made her feel self-conscious. "Well, I've only had scraps before, sir. But yes, I do, sir." "You did an excellent job at cooking it. Has anyone taught you how?" "My mother used to be the cook for Prince Iniquity, and when I was younger I helped her. She made lamb a lot." At the mention of her mother, the sight of her mother being dragged off by guards popped back into her mind. Tears quickly welled up in her eyes as she tried to block the image, but she couldn't, her mother's hands reaching out to her own. The sight tore Fearful's heart out. "Why weren't you there? You could have stopped him. You could have saved Mother," Fearful screamed at her father, who had just come back. "I'm sorry, little Rose, but your mother died, eh?" Her father put a comforting arm around her. She shoved him away, putting her hands to her ears. She didn't want to listen. She didn't want to be comforted. After a few uncomfortable seconds, Prince Anointed One laid a gentle hand on Fearful's shoulder and whispered, "We should retire. We have a busy day ahead of us." Fearful started gathering the dishes together, and an ambassador of trust headed to bed the donkeys down. Here, let me help you. Prince Anointed One started to help gather the dishes. Fearful looked at Prince Anointed with shock in her eyes. First he said please, and now he was offering to lower himself to do a slave's job? What kind of prince was he? Fearful could hardly believe what she was hearing and seeing. This was all starting to feel like a dream. I came to serve, not to be served. Does that surprise you? Fearful looked down at the ground, feeling awkward at being questioned like that, and feeling ashamed for looking up at him without being told. Even though he had told her that he wanted her to look up from now on, she still felt the shame. She had been taught it was despicable to dishonor royalty by looking at them. This was ground into her so well that it would take time to get used to the idea that a prince would think it an honor to be looked up at by a slave. It took only a minute to clean everything up. Then Fearful and Prince Anointed One headed toward the tents, while Ambassador of Trust kept watch by the fire. Fearful lay down in the tent she and her father would share. Yet she couldn't get to sleep. Her mind kept racing about. Why was Prince Anointed One so nice to her? She was just a slave. Why would he serve when there were slaves to do that? Who would he serve over here? He certainly wouldn't serve Prince Iniquity, his worst enemy. Prince Iniquity's officials were served hand and foot. So who? Fearful had questions flying around in her head. She couldn't make heads or tails of any of them. She was especially confused about a vague feeling of hope and something else rising up within her. It was something so desperate that it wouldn't settle down until it was given satisfaction. It was something so strange she couldn't describe it. Yet it seemed oddly familiar, as though she had seen the feeling displayed in someone else. The word to describe it seemed to be at the tip of her tongue, yet she couldn't think of it. Finally, out of frustration, she got up and went to the fire to sit by her father. "Excuse me." He looked at her as she sat down, but didn't say anything for a while. They sat there staring at the fire as it crackled and popped, just enjoying each other's presence. Even though she was upset that her father had not been there to protect her mother, Fearful couldn't be angry at him for long. Do you ever enjoy being by a bonfire, with some friends or a family member just sitting there quietly enjoying their presence? I do. I hope you're enjoying this. What is that? Fearful looked at her father to see he was pointing at her worn rag doll that she always slept with. She knew she was too old for dolls, but as weird as it might seem, that rag doll gave her a feeling of security and safety. The rag doll Mother made for me when I was little. I used to slip away for hours and play with her. It was during those times that I almost forgot I was a slave. I felt like nothing bad could ever happen. Quickly, Fearful wiped at the tears that had started to slip down her tanned cheeks. Silence fell over her and her father. She looked around the camp in the light of the fire. There were the 2 tents on either side of the fire ring, and the donkeys sleeping just inside the circle of flickering light. An elf owl called out in the dark, sounding like some strange, high-pitched giggle. His mate responded only a short distance away. As she sat there, Fearful started to feel that feeling again. Only this time it seemed a little more intense. It was as if something inside her soul wished to respond to the elf owls, as if they were speaking to her. Have you ever felt like something, like an animal was trying to speak to you? I wonder why. Anyhow, let's see. However, the long, hard day's walk was finally catching up with her. Though frustrated at her inability to respond to the owls and the cry in her soul, all of a sudden she was exhausted. She could hardly get herself to the tent. Her legs felt like logs, even though the ground was lumpy underneath her and the questions were still racing around in her head. Fearful fell asleep as soon as she lay down. The next morning, Fearful woke to the gray light of the dawn coming in through the open tent flap. She got up and stretched her aching limbs as she slipped out of her tent. She felt more refreshed and ready for the day than she'd ever been. "Good morning. Are you feeling rested?" Prince Anointed One questioned her, lacing up his sandals. "Yes, thank you." Fearful was continually being surprised by Prince Anointed One's kindness. "Good. One of the donkeys slipped off last night. I'm going to go looking for it." Fearful watched Prince Anointed One head out toward the east. She longed to run after him and ask all her questions. Fearing his kindness would run out, she bit her lip to restrain herself. So, instead of running after him, she turned to making breakfast. She let out a heavy sigh. Her questions would have to wait until who knew when. If only her friends were here now, they would be able to help her take her mind off her questions. She was starting to miss them a lot. She needed someone her age to talk to. Everything seemed strangely quiet without prideful and boastful's loud talk, and empty without Scaredy Cat's quiet presence. She had never known how much her life revolved around them. Have you ever missed friends because they were gone? Me too. Friends are important, aren't they? She sighed and gathered the oatmeal and pot to start breakfast. As she stoked up the fire, she sang an old song her grandmother had taught her. It was about being set free from bondage. As she sang, the song started to come to life for Fearful. The heavy burden of fear that always weighed down on her shoulders seemed to lift a little bit. As she continued to sing, she felt a small drop of joy come into her heart. She could tell Prince Anointed One and her father were starting to rub off on her. Their unlimited joy had been spilling out since yesterday morning, and now Fearful felt a small bit of that in herself. The oatmeal was done, and still her father slept, and Prince Anointed One didn't come back. Fearful wondered what to do. At the age of 6, Fearful had learned the hard way that to eat before royalty was a horrible crime. She had been whipped until she could hardly move, and then wasn't given her food rations for 2 whole days. Her stomach was starting to growl as loud as a famished lion. After a few minutes of waiting and trying not to listen to her stomach, she finally gave in to the growling protests and wolfed down a bowl of oatmeal. She hoped Prince Anointed One wouldn't find out. Once she had eaten, she grabbed an empty pail and set out for the oasis. Again, she was caught by the sense of safety. "Ah, there you are. I was wondering what had happened to you." Fearful looked up to see Ambassador of Trust coming towards her. "I'm sorry. I came to get water and was overwhelmed by the sense of safety in this place." Fearful looked around the oasis. "Yes, I know what you mean," Ambassador of Trust whispered, sitting down beside her. "Why is Prince Anointed One so kind? Why does he act like a servant when he's a prince? Why is he like he is?" "Why don't you ask him?" Ambassador of Trust pointed with his chin toward the path. There stood Prince Anointed One. Fearful made a conscious effort to look up as she scrambled to her feet. Every slave stood with respect in front of royalty. Even if you were old or crippled, you were expected to be somehow standing when royalty was in sight. "Come, I want to show you something," Prince Anointed One said, holding his hand out. That was Chapter 2. I hope you enjoyed Chapter 2 and reading with me. I enjoyed reading with you. I would love it if you would put your comments down below about what parts of the chapter you enjoyed. Maybe you tell me who your favorite character is, or maybe ask one of the questions that you would have if you were fearful and you were on the journey with Prince Anointed One. What would be your questions? Post them in the comments below. Thanks. God bless. Bye.